A surprise Rulfaire. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Hypatia Rosecombe sat in her nest, observing all that was going on. She looked at Aunt Acedia, who continued to stand on the edge of the hearth. She didn't blink, move, or speak. Hypatia just stood there, tall, thin, and menacing like a skinny feathered gargoyle. Hypatia, unlike the aunties, was neither intimidated nor impressed by Hasidia's angry raptor demeanor. In fact, she found it rather tiresome. Hypatia noticed that Mau Bewley Cornut was also not impressed with Hypatia's stony visage. As was often in the case of situations like this, or in council meetings, the old hen appeared to be sleeping. She sat with her tail feathers against the hearth, her eyes closed and her beak resting on her breast. As opposite as they were in their approach to waiting, Hypatia found them both equally boring. The other aunties, however, offered a somewhat interesting, if not mildly amusing distraction. Hypatia watched and listened as they milled around, bickering amongst themselves. "We should have already started," clucked Auntie Lydia. "How much longer are we going to have to wait? If we have to be kept here like this, they should at least serve us lunch. Oh, I'm so hungry." Auntie Sheila fluffed out her feathers in an earnest pout and whined. "Who cares? I've already missed my feather appointment. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get an appointment with Mademoiselle Poulet?" Auntie Luma clicked her beak and said, "I don't know why you bother. You go in and you spend all that corn and you come out looking as the same as when you went in." "Well, of course I do," balked Auntie Sheila. "To stay looking this good takes a lot of work." "She should work a little harder," sniggered Auntie Luma to Auntie Finny. "Well, I never," balked Auntie Sheila. "And you probably never will," clucked Auntie Luma. Auntie Sheila stuck her beak up in the air and haughtily replied, "At least I, unlike some hens I know, take pride in my appearance." "What is that supposed to mean?" balked Auntie Luma angrily. "I think it means she thinks you need to improve your appearance," said Auntie Finny. Auntie Finny, unlike the other aunties, wasn't speaking out of malice. She was actually trying to be helpful. Auntie Luma glared at Auntie Finny, who stood there smiling guilelessly. Of all the aunties, she was the least mean-spirited. In fact, she was downright friendly, which is a rare trait in an auntie. She was also the most naive and had the distinction of being the only coop hen on the Council of Aunties. "Indeed," said Auntie Sheila snidely. "It's just some hens look like they had their feathers done by an angry mid-hen." Now it was Auntie Luma's turn to stick her beak in the air. "Oh, you're just jealous," she said. "Jealous of what?" "Jealous of my natural beauty." "Oh, for corn's sake, will you two just shut up?" squawked Auntie Lydia. "Are you all right, Auntie Lydia?" asked Auntie Finny, who was genuinely concerned. Auntie Lydia snapped, "No, everything is not all right. This is intolerable. Someone should really complain." "About what?" said Auntie Finny. "This waiting," balked Auntie Lydia. "We shouldn't be kept waiting like this. They could at least provide some sort of refreshment. Someone should really say something." "Perhaps you should," said Auntie Finny. "Me?" clucked Auntie Lydia. "Why not?" said Auntie Finny. "We did, after all, designate you to be the spokesman to explain to Auntie Acedia what was going on outside." "Well, yeah, against my will and better judgment," muttered Auntie Lydia. "None the less, I thought you were succinct and to the point," said Auntie Finny encouragingly. Brightening a bit, Auntie Lydia said, "Really?" "Indeed, yes," said Auntie Finny earnestly. "Perhaps I should say something," said Auntie Lydia. She stood by, bolstered by Auntie Finny's confidence in her and a foolish heartiness that is born from being pampered, privileged, and actually not too very bright. She looked up at Aunt Hesidia and clucked up. "Aunt Hesidia, may I have a word?" Aunt Hesidia stood still, motionless on the edge of the hearth, looked down at Aunt Helidia, who actually shivered under her cold gaze. She did not speak, but merely stared. Faltering a bit, Auntie Helidia stammered, what?" said Aunt Hesidia, dropping the word on the hapless Aunt Helidia like a bucket of ice water. The other aunties took notice of what was happening and watched intently. The only thing that an auntie likes better than fussing and pecking somebody apart is the possibility of seeing someone else get into trouble. The scenario being played out before them seemed to promise not to disappoint. Auntie Helidia wanted to turn her tail feathers and run, but seeing that everyone was looking at her and the fact that Aunt Finny was behind her, practically propping her up, she composed herself and anxiously clucked. "I implore you, if we're going to have to continue waiting, couldn't we at least have some refreshments? Some of us, such as myself, have not eaten since breakfast." After a few seconds of what seemed like an eternity, it dawned on the aunties that Aunt Hesidia was not going to bring her wrath down on Aunt Helidia's pointed head. Emboldened by this, Aunt Denoria clucked up, "I agree, some grubs and crickets would be nice, and maybe a little corn on the side." "Oh, I'd like that," said Auntie Fiddy, joining in, "except could you hold the grubs and the crickets?" "Then you're just having corn?" said Aunt Denoria. Aunt Finny smiled and said, "Yes, without the grubs and crickets. I don't like food that wiggles, chirps, or kicks." The aunties, like all chickens, have a strong flock mentality. When one hen gets an idea to do something brave, such as order lunch from Aunt Hesidia, the others see that the offending hen is not going to be plucked apart. Each will soon join in. Aunt Hesidia was not amused, but Hypatia, on the other hand, thought it was quite hilarious. The aunties started to bicker and balk amongst themselves and getting lost in the moment. Just as Aunt Hesidia started to make a move to lay into all of them, suddenly someone was banging and shouting on the door. "Open up! Open up, I say!" Then someone else started banging on the windows and rattling the shutters. Soon the sounds of many angry, restless chickens outside, who were all in the throes of the flock mentality, could be heard. Startled, Auntie Thalia threw up her wings and began squawking. "Oh, my word, it's an uprising! The corn workers heard that we were going to cut their corn allowance, and now they're attacking. It's the revolution! Ah!" "Who said we were going to cut the corn workers' corn allowance?" asked Auntie Glinda, who looked at Auntie Melita and asked, "Did anyone say anything to you about this?" "Well, this is the first I'm hearing about it." Auntie Thalia started to run around the cabin, flapping her wings and squawking, "It's an uprising! It's an uprising! Hide! Hide! Everyone hide!" This again triggered the flock's mentality, and soon they all were running around in a panic, barking, squawking. The only ones not joining in were a slumbering Maw Bewley, Aunt Hesidia, and Hypatia. Hypatia calmly stood up from her nest and walked over to Aunt Hesidia and said, "I'd like a word with you in private." Aunt Hesidia replied, "Of course, Superior Mother. Follow me." The two stepped off the hearth and went behind the chimney to Aunt Hesidia's kindling box. Aunt Hesidia pulled back the curtain for Hypatia to enter and said, "This is as private as it gets around here." Hypatia walked in and looked around. She had never been in Aunt Hesidia's home before. "Interesting decor," she remarked. "It's all rather pointy." Aunt Hesidia replied matter-of-factly, "These are artifacts that I believed once belonged to the giant human Firmir. Indeed, replied Hypatia with interest. And what do you suppose they were used for? Remaining expressionless, Aunt Hesidia said they were most likely weapons. Some, I believe, were instruments of torture. I see, said Hypatia curiously. Are you like Aunt Thalia and expecting a revolution? Hesidia harshly replied, that foolish old biddy, if an acorn fell on that point she calls a head, she'd scream the sky is falling. Hypatia cocked her head to one side and said, from all the noise outside it sounds as if there are a lot of acorns falling on a lot of very angry heads. Aunt Hesidia clucked disdainfully. That's just a bit of fracas started by that yokeless old fool Biddy Polichick. I bet it was she I heard banging on the door a while ago. That pretentious middle-class twit is always stirring up trouble and making demands for things to which she is not entitled. I imagine that she has rallied her brood to make all kinds of trouble. Patty agreed. Yes, Biddy can be quite vocal, and she does have a rather large brood. However, as large as her brood is, it sounds like there's just a lot more than just her bunch out there. Aunt Hesidia shrugged and said, no doubt there are other malcontents who've joined in. Aunt Hesidia then went and took a rusty fork off the wall and held it in her wings. She then deftly twirled it around her head and shoulders, and then spinning it around, she assumed a tack position and said, if you like, I will be more than happy to go out there and deal with them. Oh, no doubt you would, said Hypatia. But I feel it would set a bad precedent if we start skewering our citizenry. What I am more concerned about are those rumors about corn cuts. Holding the fork in her wing, Aunt Hesidia casually replied, what about them? The superior mother hen replied, I was wondering what you knew about it. I know nothing about corn cuts, said Aunt Hesidia flatly. But as you know, I am trying to devise a plan to conserve our corn and redistribute it more effectively because the yield is not as great this year as it was last year. And you have discussed these plans with anyone in particular? Asked Hypatia. Of course not, clucked Aunt Hesidia indignantly. That would be improper if not outright seditious. I know perfectly well that all plans and innovations and changes to any procedure are brought to you first for discussion and revision, and then it is brought to the Council of Aunties for additional discussion and revision if necessary. It is then voted on, and the plan is implemented depending on whether it passes or not. Hypatia raised her wing in a conciliatory gesture and said, it's just that I know how our parliamentary procedure can be irksome to you, especially the way that some of the aunties like to cluck, balk, and peck everything apart. It is the way things are, said Aunt Hesidia. I accept and respect the process that governs our society, even if it is irksome. Good, said Hypatia. I'm glad we cleared that up. I should have never have doubted you, Hesidia. You are a true patriot. I suspect the source of these rumors are from disgruntled corn workers who are unhappy about your policies. No doubt, said Aunt Hesidia flatly. Suddenly there was a loud bang and a crash, followed by the screeching of hysterical aunties. Hypatia raised her eyebrows and then said matter-of-factly, unless I'm mistaken, it sounds like disgruntled corn workers breaking our door down right now. Then there was the sound of many feet running around outside. Annoyed, Hypatia then added, sounds like they're tearing the place apart, and just when we finished redecorating. At that moment, there was the sound of someone rustling outside the curtained door. Aunt Hesidia raised her wingtip to her beak in a sign for Hypatia not to speak. She then eased towards the curtain and slowly raised her weapon. Then in a flash she ripped the curtain back and lunged forward to skewer whoever was there, which unfortunately was Aunt Thalia. Aunt Hesidia stopped just short of skewering her in the face. Aunt Thalia stood there in frozen terrors with eyes and beak wide open as she stared down the pointy tines of the fork. Then all the blood drained out of her comb, and she fainted. At that precise moment, Auntie Finny poked her head in over the prostrate body and said, "Oh, Superior Mother! Aunt Hesidia, there you are! We were looking for you." She then noticed Aunt Thalia lying on the floor and said, "Oh, goodness me, what happened here?" "Was there something you needed to tell us?" asked Hypatia. Snapping her attention back to the Superior Mother hen, Auntie Finny quickly replied, "Oh yes, Superior Mother, indeed there was. We wanted to tell you that Vance is back. He said that the Pinfeathers are on their way." "On their way?" snapped Aunt Hesidia. "They should already be here, and he was supposed to bring them with him." "I suppose we could ask him," said Aunt Finny, "but he is a bit busy at the moment." "Busy doing what?" snarled Aunt Hesidia. "Being chased," said Auntie Finny. Hypatia balked. "Being chased? By who? Has the mob from outside broken in?" "No, the mob outside is still outside," said Aunt Finny. "It's the mob inside that's the problem." "What are you blathering about?" balked Aunt Hesidia angrily. Aunt Finny cringed and quickly explained, "Oh, well, you see, when Vance came back, some of the aunties were upset because he didn't bring them any lunch." "I see," said Hypatia. She then turned to Aunt Hesidia and said, "You better go and straighten this out before Vance gets pecked, plucked, and pulled apart." Aunt Hesidia nodded and started to go out the door when Hypatia stopped her. "But leave your weapon here," she cautioned. "We don't want any accidents to happen." Aunt Hesidia narrowed her eyes at Hypatia, and she briefly debated disobeying the Superior Mother hen. Finally, she abruptly handed Hypatia her fork and then shoved out past Auntie Finny, nearly knocking her over. Staggering to keep her balance, Aunt Finny turned to Hypatia and said, "What would you like me to do, Superior Mother?" Hypatia hung the fork back on the wall, and then she turned to Auntie Finny and said, "Oh, you should attend to Aunt Thalia," and then she left. Auntie Finny clucked, "Who?" and then she looked down and realized that she had forgotten all about her fellow auntie. Clucking tenderly, she reached down to help her up. "Come on, Thalia, this is not the time or place to be napping." Meanwhile, Vance, who was trying to evade 4 of the angrier aunties, had taken refuge under a box. The irate aunties were meanwhile beating on it and demanding that he come out and take his plucking like a chicken. Then suddenly they felt a chill. One by one they stopped banging on the box and turned to see Aunt Hesidia standing there. Though she is not much taller than they, she had a way of looming over them and making herself appear taller. Or maybe it was just the way they cringed that made them seem smaller. Aunt Hesidia glared until the aunties backed away. Then she took her leg and kicked the box over to reveal Vance sitting there with his wings over his eyes. When he peeked through his wing feathers and saw Aunt Hesidia standing over him, he quickly stood up and smoothed his ruffled feathers. He primly clucked, "Ah, Aunt Hesidia, just the chicken I need to see." Aunt Hesidia stared at Vance like a hawk getting ready to devour her prey. "Where are the Pinfeathers?" she demanded. Before Vance could respond, there was a loud cry outside the door of the cabin and the sound of many chickens scattering and barking and screeching. Suddenly the door burst open and was nearly knocked off what hinges it had. "Well, I believe they just arrived," said Vance. Through the door 5 large mid-hands stooped down as they entered the cabin one at a time. The last one to come in was Wedgie. She stood just inside the door. "Fan out and make sure the cabin is secure," she ordered. The 4 mid-heads nodded and immediately went all around the cabin, checking everywhere, even the Mother Superior hen's nest. When she caught a stunned look from Hypatia, the mid-hen merely replied, "Sorry, Superior Mother, but you can't be too careful." Finally, the 4 mid-hens finished their inspection and reported back to Wedgie. One mid-hen sharply nodded her head and said, "All clear." Wedgie nodded her head and said, "Good job, girls." She then stuck her head out the door and called, "All clear," and then through the door came the Pinfeathers, Viona, and Peck. Fudgy came and stood before Vance. "Mission accomplished," she said crisply. "The Pinfeathers and Company are reporting to the Council of Aunties as ordered." "Very good," said Vance. "You and the rest of the ladies stay outside and maintain crowd control." Fudgy nodded and immediately executed a well-practiced about-face and exited the cabin. Vance then turned to Wedgie and the mid-hens and said, "You ladies will stay in here to make sure the Council of Aunties meeting is not disrupted." Wedgie nodded. She then turned to the 4 other mid-hens and said, "All right, ladies, 10, hut!" The mid-hen snapped to attention. Then Wedgie sharply commanded, "Assume your positions." The 4 mid-hens went and stood in front of the hearth, and Wedgie positioned herself next to the door. Hypatia looked on in amazement. Even Aunt Acidia could not hide her astonishment. The other aunties also stood there with their beaks opened in stunned silence. Around the corner of the hearth came Auntie Finny, escorting a still slightly wobbly Auntie Thalia. Auntie Finny cheerfully observed, "Oh, good, they haven't started yet." Aunt Thalia responded with an incoherent "Mama Bewley, who had still been seemingly asleep against the hearth, stood up, stretched, and fluffed out her feathers. She looked around and nodded. She then went and stood in between Aunt Hasidia and Hypatia. "Nae too bad for a fuzzy roo," she clucked. Vance, bowing slightly, said, "Thank you, Auntie Bewley. I consider that high praise." "It is rather impressive, Vance," said Hypatia. "I didn't know you carried such weight with the mid-hens." "Well, it's because I used to coach them in scramble," said Vance. "I didn't know you scrambled," said Hypatia, mildly surprised. She turned to Aunt Hasidia and asked, "Were you aware of this?" "No, Superior Mother, I was not," said Aunt Hasidia. "Didn't we used to have a scramble chick league?" asked Hypatia. "I believe so, Superior Mother," said Aunt Hasidia, "but it was discontinued due to problems with injuries." "What, you mean among the chicks?" asked Hypatia. "The coaches," said Aunt Hasidia. "Some of the parents took the game very seriously, and if a team lost, the parents often took it out on the coach." Hypatia chuckled, cluck, and said, "Oh, yes, I remember now. I suppose the game may be a bit too rough for our younger chicks, or at least their coaches. I have heard it said the game is a bit like war, except scramble isn't as civilized. I believe if we ever go to war, I'm sure our scramble players will provide an excellent first line of defense." "Or offense," thought Aunt Hasidia to herself. She had always felt that the mid-hens would make excellent warriors, and should they ever declare war on some of the creatures of the deep brush. But she did not want to say it aloud because she knew that the superior mother hen did not share her vision of military dominance. Aunt Hesidia's thoughts of conquest of the deep brush were rudely interrupted by the harsh barking of Maw Bewley. "Are y'all going around and gossip, or are you going to get on with this? Maybe we uns could just go on home and forget about it." "No, I don't think that would be appropriate," said Hypatia, who really would have rather they did, and hopefully hinted by saying to Aunt Hesidia, "Can we?" "Absolutely not," replied Aunt Hesidia sharply. "The allegations made against the Pinfeathers are serious and must be addressed." Annoyed, Hypatia said, "Well, having my breakfast ruined, I was hoping for an early lunch, but I suppose that's too much to ask." Aunt Hesidia's response was just to stand there and stare, saying that Aunt Hesidia either did not get the hint or just chose to ignore it. Hypatia grumbled and grunted to herself as she hopped back up onto the hearth, and once up there she called out to the other aunties, "All right, you lot, let's get this over with." The aunties also grumbled and grunted as they got up onto the hearth, and they took their place one by one. Hypatia seated herself on the edge of her nest in the fireplace. As she squirmed around to get comfortable, the superior mother hen felt something. Then she nosed down in the nest, and she found, much to her pleasant surprise, some corn nuggets that had fallen among the nesting material from a previous meal. She quickly snapped one up and swallowed it, and then looked around to see if anyone noticed. No one did. Aunt Hesidia, as overseer of the Galliard court, stood to the right of Hypatia's nest, and Vance, as the Galliard court scratcher, sat at a small table that was low enough for him to sit there and use his foot to hold a quill to record the proceedings. In front of Vance was a stack of dried corn husk papers flattened out for him to use. To his right was a small vial of ink made from berries. As he sat there, Vance realized that he had misplaced his quill. Undeterred, he reached around and plucked out one of his tail feathers. He then held it in his right foot as he sharpened it with his beak. When he finished, he examined the tip. Satisfied, he dipped it in the ink and sat ready to record. The aunties, according to their social status, seated themselves in two rows on one side of Vance. Chick leaned over to Peck and whispered, "Why is Vance sitting up there?" "Well, because he's the official scratcher of the Galliard court," said Peck. "It's his job to record what's going on." "I thought he was supposed to be our Rulfaire," said Chick. "He can't do both jobs, can he?" "I wouldn't think so," said Chick. "Maybe he's not your Rulfaire." "Then who is?" peeped Chick. Before Peck could answer, Hypatia suddenly barked out, "Quiet!" Both Peck and Chick were startled into silence, as well as the other hens, who were whispering among themselves. Hypatia then looked around and said, "Are we ready?" Excuse me, Superior Mother." Frustrated, Hypatia wagged her head and squawked, "What is it?" She then turned to her left, and at the edge of the hearth, the last auntie in the back row was Auntie Finny, who was anxiously waving her wing. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I have a question." With strained patience, Hypatia said, "What is it, Finny?" "What is the first item on our agenda?" Hypatia turned to Aunt Hesidia. "As overseer of the Galliard court, I believe that question goes to you." Aunt Hesidia tightened her beak and replied, "The first and only item on our agenda is the allegation of crimes committed against the homestead by the Pinfeather brood, as well as charges of other unchicken-like behavior." Hypatia looked over at Auntie Finny and asked, "Anything else?" "No, I don't think so," said Auntie Finny. Hypatia nodded and said, "Very well." She then turned to Aunt Hesidia and said, "You may proceed." Aunt Hesidia nodded and walked to the edge of the hearth. She then spread out her wings and spoke out in a loud, commanding voice. "All present, draw nigh and give heed to the Council of Aunties is now in session. The first item on the agenda is the allegations of crimes committed against the homestead by the Pinfeather brood. Is the Pinfeather brood present?" June then quickly responded, "We are here." Aunt Hesidia proceeded. "You have been summoned here before the Council of Aunties to answer to the allegations of crimes committed against the homestead. Before these charges are read, do you have anyone to advocate for you?" Before June could answer, Auntie Finny began clucking loudly and waving her wing. Excuse me, Aunt Hesidia." "Point of order," said Vaunch, cutting Auntie Finny off. "During these proceedings, Aunt Hesidia is to be referred to as Madam Overseer." Flustered, Auntie Finny clucked, "Oh, yes, I'm sorry." She then began waving her wing and balking. "Madam Overseer! Madam Overseer!" Aunt Hesidia closed her eyes and ground her beak. "What is it now?" she growled. Fidgeting, Aunt Finny stood up and said, "Yes, well, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I'm afraid I need to be excused from sitting on the Council of Aunties." Surprised and pleased, Aunt Hesidia asked, hopefully, "Permanently?" Clucking with cheerful nervousness, Aunt Finny replied, "Oh, no, not permanently, just for today." Annoyed and disappointed, Aunt Hesidia asked, "And pray tell us why?" It's because I've been retained as the Pinfeather's Rulfaire." Unable to contain her shock, Aunt Hesidia squawked, "You? A Rulfaire? Is this a joke?" Fidgeting, Aunt Finny replied even more cheerfully and more anxiously, "No, ma'am, I assure you it's not a joke. I have been working very hard for some time, studying all the rules and their exceptions." Hypatia was trying to inconspicuously sneak another corn nugget, but when she heard what Aunt Finny had said, she was so surprised that she dropped her nugget. She then leaned towards Aunt Hesidia and said, "I didn't think there were any Rulfaires left." "There aren't," snapped Auntie Hesidia. "There haven't been any Rulfaires probably since Auntie Cornot was a pullet." Maw Bewley, who was sitting to Hesidia's right, did not respond and appeared to be asleep. Her eyes were closed and her beak was resting on her breast. "Apparently we were wrong," said Hypatia. She fumbled around trying to find the corn nugget she dropped. Aunt Hesidia stalked over to Aunt Finny, and with narrowed eyes she leaned in on the hapless hen and clucked lowly, "If you are indeed a Rulfaire, I assumed you've already passed your examination." Aunt Finny's voice quavered a bit as she replied, "Yes, ma'am, I have." Aunt Hesidia gave a low, long balk that sounded like a growl. "I see. And who was your examiner?" Cringing, Auntie Finny said, "Begging the Madam Overseer's pardon, that information is privileged." "Privileged?" squawked Auntie Hesidia. "I'll have you know, you yokeless twit, there is none more privileged than me, and I demand to know who certified you as a Rulfaire. If you do not tell me, then we can always add another item to the Council of Aunties' agenda." "Another item?" replied Aunt Finny anxiously. Smiling like a snake, Aunt Hesidia replied, "Yes, the item to pluck you of your title of auntie and have you kicked off the council for trying to impersonate a Rulfaire." Stammering, Aunt Finny insisted, But I am a Rulfaire, and I have passed my examinations." Then tell me, who was your examiner? Demanded Aunt Hesidia. Aunt Fanny was almost to the point of tears when Vance spoke up. Point of order, Madam Overseer, point of order. Aunt Hesidia turned and looked at Vance with a glare hard enough to cut stone and barked. What? Undeterred, Vance calmly replied, Point of order, Madam Overseer. But Aunt Fanny is correct. According to the Rulfaire's rules of conduct, all discussions and consultations and other communications between Rulfaires and the clients is confidential and may not be divulged. This would also include any and all teaching, tutoring, and final exams conducted between a certified Rulfaire and her student, who would in fact also be considered a client. In addition, the same would apply to Auntie Finny, as these guidelines are applicable to Rulfaire students too. As a certified Rulfaire, she cannot divulge who her examiner was under any circumstances to anyone. Not even to the superior mother hen? Asked Hypatia, who was listening with keen interest. No, superior mother, not even to you, said Vance. She is simply to submit her credentials to the official clerk of the Galliarch court, which is me, and she did so this morning. I have them here if you would like to examine them. Hypatia nodded and motioned for Vance to come forward. As he did, Auntie Hesidia also came over and snatched the corn husk from Vance, as she and Hypatia examined it together. Well, it has the official Rulfaire seal, said Hypatia, a thistle with a butterfly and a bee on it. The position of bee and butterfly seems to be correct, said Auntie Hesidia as she held it up to the light. It appears to be genuine. Taken aback, Hypatia said, Surely Auntie Fanny wouldn't try to forge a Rulfaire seal. Auntie Hesidia shook her head and replied, No, she's not smart enough for that. As much as I hate to admit it, these credentials are genuine. Glaring at Vance, she handed him back the corn husk. You seem to be exceptionally well versed on the rules concerning Rulfaires, she said suspiciously. Thank you, Madam Overseer, said Vance as he tucked the husk under his wing. As scratcher for the Galliarch court, I pride myself on knowing all the rules and exceptions concerning such matters. Indeed, said Aunt Hesidia evenly, it is as if you yourself were a Rulfaire. Vance smiled and said, Indeed, Madam Overseer, you flatter me. However, my knowledge of such things pales in comparison to yours. If only I could be a Rulfaire, but as you are well aware, it is tradition that all Rulfaires have been hens and not roosters. Aunt Hesidia regarded Vance coolly and said, Traditions have been known to change. She then turned to Auntie Fanny and said, Since your Rulfaire credentials have been determined to be authentic and not some absurd practical joke, you are excused from sitting on the Council of Aunties. But just for today, right? Asked Aunt Fanny anxiously. Exasperated, Aunt Hesidia closed her eyes and said, Yes, unfortunately, just for today, unless by the next meeting you just happen to be the Rulfaire for someone else whose case you will be hearing. Somewhat surprised, Aunt Fanny put a wing tip to her beak and said, Oh, well, I never thought of that. Do you think it's possible that I would be asked to represent someone else? Aunt Hesidia sarcastically replied, Stranger things have happened, such as a coop hen becoming an auntie. Oblivious to Aunt Hesidia's sarcasm, Aunt Fanny replied, Well, certainly, if that happens, I will be sure to let you know, Madam Overseer. Sneering, Aunt Hesidia replied, Oh, how considerate of you. Now that we settled that, Madame Rulfaire, shall we continue? Auntie Fanny stood there staring blankly at Aunt Hesidia. Then suddenly it dawned on her. Aunt Hesidia was addressing her. "Oh, you mean me? Yes, by all means." Aunt Hesidia then turned to the Superior Mother Hen and said, "Superior Mother, now that we have settled this matter, shall we continue?" Having just swallowed another corn nugget, startled, Hypatia abruptly raised her head and replied, Oh, yes, of course, by all means." Some of the other aunties eyed Hypatia suspiciously, but didn't say anything. As for Aunt Hesidia, other than just great annoyance, the overseer gave no indication that she knew or even cared what Hypatia was up to. She just turned back to Auntie Fanny and said, "Madame Rulfaire, would you like to make an opening statement?" Startled again, Auntie Fanny jumped and chuckled nervously. "Oh, yes, me, yes, of course." Aunt Hesidia closed her eyes and ground her beak and replied tersely, "Yes, you." Auntie Fanny clucked happily and nervously replied, "Oh, my, Madame Rulfaire, oh, yes, that's me, being called. Oh, this is going to take some getting used to." "Sometime today," said Aunt Hesidia, who was near her breaking point. Auntie Fanny, not sure what to do, nodded and curtsied. Then she said, "Yes, I would like to request a recess." "Oh, what on earth for?" squawked Aunt Hesidia. With shaking but growing confidence, Aunt Fanny replied, "So that I may consult with my clients." Aunt Hesidia then turned to Hypatia and furiously balked. "Mother Superior, I protest. The Rulfaire is making a mockery of these proceedings, and I demand that she be removed from advocating for the Pinfeathers." Before Hypatia could respond, Auntie Fanny countered, "Begging your pardon, Madam Overseer, but you can't do that. I cite the rule of Rulfaire representation, Section 5, Article 2. A Rulfaire who accepts a case cannot be removed from said case by any authority, including the Council of Aunties and members of the Galliot Court, not even the Superior Mother Hen. The exceptions to this rule are only in the event the Rulfaire is dead or otherwise incapacitated by serious illness." Aunt Hesidia asked mockingly, "Does being a twit and a lame brain count as a serious illness?" "It does not," replied Aunt Fanny confidently. Before Hypatia could fire off any more objections or insults, Hypatia asked, "Madame Rulfaire, why have you not met with your clients before now?" "Well, I've been very busy," said Auntie Fanny. Balking loudly, Aunt Hesidia asked, "Doing what?" Struggling to maintain her shaky confidence, Auntie Fanny replied, "Taking my Rulfaire exams, of course." In stark amazement, Aunt Hesidia stared at Aunt Fanny. "Taking your Rulfaire exam," she echoed quietly. Fully expecting Aunt Hesidia to swoop down and peck her eyes out, Aunt Fanny took a step back and nodded. But before Aunt Hesidia could respond, object, or make any other motion, Hypatia quickly intervened and shouted, "Granted!" Stunned, Aunt Hesidia stared at Hypatia, who stood up from her nest and declared, "I grant the Rulfaire's motion for a recess." Hypatia, having run out of corn nuggets, was still hungry. She was also still annoyed that Aunt Hesidia had ruined her breakfast and took this opportunity to strike a blow for an early lunch. She then added, "We will reconvene in make that 2 hours." She then turned to Vance and replied, "Could you see that the lunch is brought in and have the mid-hens help?" Vance replied, "Yes, Superior Mother." "And where you're at it, have the mid-hens ready to do crowd control because I think in view of recent developments, we should let the public come in and observe. Do you think that is wise, Superior Mother? Asked Aunt Hesidia. I don't see why not, replied Hypatia. I don't know of any expressed rules against letting chickens come in while the Council of Aunties is in session. Do you? None that I'm aware of, said Aunt Hesidia in the tone that she seemed to say she wished there was. Well, it could diffuse the situation considering the rumors, offered Vance. Or make it worse, replied Aunt Hesidia bitterly. Oh, I think Vance has a point, said Hypatia. Everyone is out there because of the rumors, so I say let them in so they can see we have nothing to hide. Realizing there was nothing she could do at this point, Aunt Hesidia reluctantly conceded and replied, I suppose having the riffraff inside is better than having them outside trampling the yard. That's the spirit, said Hypatia heartily as she hopped down from the hearth. Aunt Hesidia ground her beak and responded with thinly veiled sarcasm. Shall we invite the riffraff to share our lunch? Oh, that's a good point, said Hypatia. For a split second, Aunt Hesidia thought the Superior Mother Hen was actually going to have the mob come in to dine, but was relieved when she heard Hypatia say to Vance, Vance, while we are having lunch, have Wedgie go outside and announce that we are in recess and that when we reconvene our proceedings, they will be open to the public. Yes, Superior Mother, said Vance. And since we're letting the public in, we don't want anyone to get too excited or disrupt the proceedings. So let's keep the mid-hens in position. Vance bowed and went to carry out the Superior Mother Hen's orders. Aunt Hesidia stepped down from the hearth and stood next to Hypatia, who turned to her cousin and said, Oh, Hesidia, try not to look so dour. I'm sure everything will be okay. Aunt Hesidia replied tersely, If you say so, Superior Mother. Oh, I do, said Hypatia confidently. You will see once we let the public in and they see how dull these proceedings are. I imagine the majority of them will leave. Aunt Hesidia did not respond. She thought to herself that from the way the things have gone so far, the rest of this meeting was going to be anything but dull.